Our efforts this past year, really a year and a half, have been aimed at pikuach nefesh, preserving life, protecting life, ensuring the health and safety of our families, those around us, and our various circles of contact, from the bank and the post office to the grocery store to the mailman or the Amazon Prime delivery person to the wider society. It's been a major concern. And it comes to mind when we come to Ne'ilah. At Ne'ilah, the final conclusion, the last Amidah, the last service, last part of the day, closing of the gates of Yom Kippur. At the end of it, a person is supposed to say Shema Yisrael as if willing to give up one's life. Thankfully, we probably aren't called to Kiddush Hashem in that way, but our lives can and should be Kiddush Hashem, a sanctification of God's name through life, not through the opposite of life. Here are two tales that have to do with Kiddush Hashem on various scales. Maybe you can keep them in mind when you're davening Ne'ilah, wherever you'll be. Maybe they'll be helpful. Maybe they'll give you good things to think about. A story has just been translated from a Yiddish speech that Rabbi Soloveitchik gave to rabbinic alumni of Yeshiva University in the 1950s. That's actually longer ago than the gap between when the story took place and the Rav's retelling of it. Although it happened well over a century ago, it's an absolutely astounding story. Hasn't been published yet, but it's in the works. I heard it from an insider. Rabbi Soloveitchik told it himself about his grandfather, of Chaim Brisker. The year 1906 was a banner year for radical politics and anarchists, particularly violent ones. It happened that year that a young Jewish activist, a member of the Bund, the Allgemeiner Jiddischer Arbeiterbund in Litauen, Poland, and Russland, decided to attempt an assassination of a government official called Trepov. He was a police chief, he was a governor general. So someone threw a bomb at this Tsarist official, which failed. However, Trepov was shaken by the incident. He died a few weeks later of a heart attack. The police arrested this Jewish activist on suspicion of attempted assassination, and the young fellow, as it turned out, was from the town of Brisk in Lithuania. There was news that got out that he had been captured, he had been put on trial, and he was sentenced to death within 24 hours. When did that news reach the town of Brisk? On Kol Nidre night. When Rav Chaim Brisker was told that this boy had been sentenced to death, the Chazan had already started Kol Nidre. Rabbi Soloveitchik recounted what his grandfather, Rav Chaim, the Rav of Brisk, did next. He stopped the Chazan, and he banged on the bima for everyone's attention. He explained the situation, what happened, that a boy's life was at stake, a Jewish boy, and everyone should right away go immediately home and bring all the money that they had on hand. This is Erev Yom Kippur, remember. Then he sent the shamas around to all the shuls in town. He was the chief rabbi of Brisk, and tell them that Kol Nidre should not be said until everyone had brought all the money they could put their hands on. People raced out of shul and they came back carrying money, apparently some 3,000 rubles. They went to the police commissioner of Brisk with 3,000 rubles in hand on Kol Nidre night and explained the situation, and they were able to persuade the police commissioner to provide an alibi for the boy. The commissioner and the rabbi took an overnight train to Moscow. Today it's 14 hours. I don't know what it was 100 years ago. And they arrived in Moscow together the morning of Yom Kippur. With the rabbi in tow, the police commissioner of Brisk went to the judge of the case, the magistrate, whoever it was, and swore an alibi that the boy who had been accused and convicted was actually with him in Brisk, wasn't even in the town where the crime occurred. The convicted activist was set free. When we talk about pikuach nefesh, we talk about hatzalas nefashos, saving and preserving life. It takes many forms. The person who told the story, who told me the story, who recounted and translated the story and told it to me, asked what would the rest of us do if we were faced with a similar situation. Maybe we'd say a chapter of Tehillim, a psalm. Maybe we'd write a letter to somebody in the government. Maybe we'd say, well, nothing I can do about it from where I'm sitting. It's terrible, but that's the way the world works. That's not what the Brisker Rav thought. Here was a chance to save a life. Did he consider that the person in question was a Bundist, an anti-religious person? If he did, it didn't seem to slow him down one moment. He leapt into action, and he didn't stop until he felt he had done everything in his power to save, to rescue this person from execution. suggest to you that life-saving isn't necessarily always so heroic or so dramatic. There was an Israeli fellow named Shapiro who was a retired professor living in Yerushalayim, and he told us another story about another boy from a secular home, a communist home. One day during davening, just a regular weekday davening, this young boy came into Mr. Shapiro, Professor Shapiro's local neighborhood shul in Yerushalayim. And this boy was looking around for someone to ask questions to. He had questions burning in his mind, and he finally pulled on the sleeve of a man who was in the middle of davening. Instead of pushing him away or just wait until davening was over, this man smiled at him. He listened to his questions. He answered thoughtfully as best he could, and he said to the boy, when you have more questions, come back. And the boy came back with more questions. The boy was encouraged that someone took him in and took his questions seriously, and eventually he grew into a student. And that student grew into a scholar, and that scholar became a Talmid Chacham. And that Talmid Chacham became a leader of world Jewry. That was the story of young Adin Steinsaltz, who, to our sorrow, we also lost this past year. In writing this story, Professor Shapiro included in his essay that he published a plea, as he expressed it, a plea to those my age, he said, 85 and younger. He said it could be that a child who doesn't look like he belongs will come and bother you during davening. He'll ask you questions. He wants explanations. He'll just ask why. Why are we doing this? He said, please treat this child not as a nuisance, not as a bother, someone to shove away, but treat it like you would treat your own grandchild. He said, if people do this, we may be fortunate, we may merit enough to have another Rabbi Steinsaltz among us. Saving a life in the most simple and basic form might be no more dramatic or inciting than showing patience with a child, or the voice of questions of a child that comes from a body and mind of an adult, with questions that we may or may not be able to answer to their satisfaction. But what can we do? We can show love, we can show patience, we can show forbearance, we can show sympathy and support. All the things that Hashem shows us now on Yom Kippur, especially now at Ne'ilah, the closing of the gates at the end of Yom Kippur. After Yom Kippur, we'll be in a new place, we'll be at a new level, we'll have more ability, more will be asked, more will be expected of us to preserve and protect and save lives, physical lives and spiritual lives. We'll be surrounded with opportunities for kindness, for concern, for love, for empathy, for action. May we all be sealed now in the book of life for a healthy and happy year, and may we continue to support each other and others around us through challenging times when so much is at stake. Gemar Chatima Tova.